This is October 19th, 1988. Coleman Barkin interviewing Anna Freitag.
Where were you born?
Bridgeport, Connecticut,
How long ago?
1921. That's about 67 when we came to Hastings. Yeah, 1921,
And when did you come to Hastings?
1929.
What did your parents do? And who were you?
My dad was Joseph Boulanger. He was a barber, and I think the second hairdresser in Hastings. He chose Hastings because there was a barber shop for sale who was formerly owned by Mr. Stroman. It was on the corner of Spring Street and what was Dock Street. What is it now? What is the avenue going down to the railroad now?
Right by the library?
Where the cafe is, the buffet. What is that called now? It used to be called Dock Street, anyhow. But he came here, South Side, that's what it is now. But, and my mother was Mary Hegedus, and she was a pure Hungarian. My father spoke 5 languages because of the area that he was born in. But my mother was pure Hungarian. She was not bilingual because she was brought up in the center of Hungary. If one is on the periphery or a border country, they were always bilingual. The reason I mention this is because my mother was a city girl at heart, resented terribly moving to Hastings, which was a very one-horse little town. And there were not many people that she could really relate to because they were very bilingual and what have you. But nevertheless, Daddy wanted to come to Hastings because he had come here when he came from Europe. And he lived on Dock Street or South Side Avenue and had worked in the Anaconda for a very short time. And at that time they had hotbeds, and because the men worked around the clock. And he knew Hastings, but didn't choose to stay down at the factory and had left. So when he had this opportunity to buy the store in Hastings, why, he thought we would come up. His sales pitch to my mother was, they have this beautiful new building, which was the municipal building, which was being completed that year of 1920. And the other thing, there is the water, and you could take the children swimming. But anyhow, it took my mother many years, if ever, she had gotten used to living in Hastings.
You mentioned hotbed. Can you...
Hotbed is similar to what they had in Las Vegas in the early years. They used to advertise for day sleepers, and Hastings was the same way because Anaconda and I guess Zinger's was in full production, and they had many immigrants that worked in the factories, and many of the people on South Side Avenue, Railroad Avenue, Washington Avenue rented out rooms, and in fact they would have someone sleep during the day and then someone sleep during the night. So this is why I say the day sleepers usually had what one called a hotbed. As I say, Las Vegas, I don't remember years ago, always advertised for day sleepers. I don't know if because we went there many, when the strip was just a strip, nothing. And as I say, the motels were always advertising for day sleepers, and I guess they were doing the same thing in Hastings, and that's what is a hotbed.
What did your dad do at Anaconda?
I don't know what he did. I don't think he was qualified for any specialty work. So I don't know what one did in the Anaconda. I know they had, when I say they, my mother and father were married quite young, and when they first came, they went out to Detroit, because there you were getting $5 a day for being a floor sweeper, and that seemed very lucrative. Daddy, as I say, his trade was a barber, but they went out there for the fast buck, so to speak. Didn't stay very long, and when I don't know if he was here before he married, but he was not skilled, so it must have been very menial work that he did, maybe comparable to sweeping floors. I don't know, but certainly nothing skilled.
And then where they found this building? Did he want us to move back to Hastings? Where was that located?
The barber shop that he bought, right on the corner of the end of Spring Street as it went down South Side. It was owned by Mr. Stroman, who had been in Hastings for many, many years and was the local barber. And he was ready to sell. But it was a lovely spot because there was a large window in the front and a large window on the side that overlooked the park. There was the chess table. And we still have the chess table from where the men in the barber shop used to sit and play chess. And they owned the building, and the Stromans lived upstairs. But that's the shop that Daddy did buy. And
So by having the chess table, did that make the barber shop more than just a place to come and get your haircut?
I would think so, because barber shops in that era, as I'm sure you must know, were the places where one congregated. And you sat, and if the barber wasn't busy in the afternoon, you played with chess with him, or you played chess with someone else that was there. All the men had their cups, their barber cups, and they were all there. We have some of those. But you see, in that time, the men came just about every day to be shaved. And they came to, as I say, kibitz and swap news of the day. And it was very nice.
Explain about these barber cups.
Oh, the barber cups, they are similar to each man of distinction, maybe, if not, but who came regularly, had his own barber cup and his brush in the cup and the soap, so that it was rather a personal touch, you see. So when you came in each morning, you had your brush and your soap, and the barber just had a little water, lathered it up, and put it on your face. And there was a niche and a special place for your barber cup. And that was it. Barber shops at that time stayed open Saturdays, all day, half day on Sunday. They stayed open till 10 o'clock on Saturday nights. And I guess that was it.
So there was a regular clientele that would come?
A regular clientele that came to be shaved. In later years, it was the same thing. I can remember Daddy in the 50s. He had his regular clientele for shaves, and one was John Ritz, who was the one-armed lawyer in Hastings, and he came every morning. Mr. Jacobson, who owned the local pharmacy. He had several people. Mr. Kane, who had a very high-class saloon down by Farragut Parkway. And he came with his Hamburg, and he came every day for his shave. And then there was a Father White, I think his name was. that used to come over from St. Clair Academy over across the parkway, and he used to come. Delightful person. Did his nails all the time. And it was a very nice time. Daddy had a tip-top #1 clientele in his barber shop. And all the executives from Anaconda used to come to Daddy, and it was just very nice. It was a nice, as I say, clientele, nice shop. And
How many barbers were there in the barber shop?
there were 3, Daddy and 2 others.
Who were the other ones? Do you remember?
Sure, Herman Eggering and Steve Quartuccio. And Steve Quartuccio's father-in-law, he was the local shoemaker. And he had his store where the funeral home is today on Spring Street. And you always went to Shoemake. That's all you ever called him. I don't think one ever knew his name. He was just Shoemake. And he was the one that repaired the shoes.
Who was the other person that worked there?
Herman Eggering. Herman Eggering answered an ad. And he had been working in New York. His wife was a hairdresser. And they had built a home because Hastings seemed like a very desirous place. And this must have been in the 40s. And they bought the property on the end of in Uniontown. What is the street that comes down from Anvis? Goes down to St. Joseph Cemetery. And they seemed like they were in the wilderness. And Herman worked for Daddy many years. They had 1 child, and he went to West Point. He had received an appointment. It was a very nice story. And Billy did credit to Herman and his wife Josie. And they lived in Hastings until, as I say, he passed away. But it was local help that we had, and local people that we catered to. And you were barbers at that time, not hairstylists. And it was interesting. Daddy was quite a very well-read man, and very intelligent. This is, I think, one of the reasons he was very interested in politics, and he was a wonderful storyteller. And it was just a pleasure to have a father like Daddy.
Were there other services that were offered at the barber shop?
No, because at that time one was not as diversified as they are now. The only service that was offered was a manicure. Businesses at that time did not diversify as they do now. Today, the barber shop or the beauty shop are 10 other things. They're boutiques. The drugstore sells all cosmetics, and the butcher shop sells everything else. One did not diversify at one time any more than things were sold out of season. There was the local drugstore, which was on the corner of, right on the edge of the bridge, corner of Warburton, Main, and West Main going down, that lovely white building. That was owned by Mr. Todd, who was the pharmacist, tall, white-haired gentleman, always had a patch over his eye. I think he lost an eye, I don't know how. He lived upstairs, and Joe Aljo was the young man who was his pharmacist. He also had an ice cream fountain. You had chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry all the year round, but only pistachio certain months and tutti frutti ice cream only in certain months. This is apropos to one did not diversify. Today, you can avail yourself of any flavor at any time of the year. You can have peach ice cream when it isn't the peach season. But at that time, they didn't. Butterscotch candy only came out, I think, this time of year. And you got your stick of butterscotch. And it was very precious because one couldn't get butterscotch all year round. It is now the baseball game. What is it now? The series. People did not have. Not all people had radios. As a result, Aloisio Hardware. There was another electric store on Main Street, Siritax. They would put their radio outside, and all the people would congregate and listen to the game on the outside, you see, and follow the series in that manner. It was much more spirited at that time. Perhaps when I say that time, I'm speaking 30s. And when we first came to Hastings, the big event on Sundays was the baseball game. We would always see most of the village marching up Main Street to the baseball diamond up in Reynolds Field. There were local baseball teams. And they had their clubhouse across the bridge. Way across the bridge was no man's land. And I can't recall what the name was. But anyhow, they were an Irish group, and they were the ones that we went up to see every Sunday. And other villages had baseball teams, and they played our team, but we always went up and rooted for the home team. And I'm trying to think of the name. The Lyceum. That's what they call the Lyceum. And that was it. When we first came to Hastings, it was very difficult to roller skate on the streets. We had moved up here from New York City, and we had sidewalks. We used to roller skate to Central Park. You could roller skate back. And here, because of the asphalt company, all the sidewalks were paved with asphalt, which are hexagon-shaped blocks, making it very difficult for roller skating. And I remember resenting that terribly, because one could not roller skate too well on these blocks. When we moved to Hastings, Warburton Avenue, I don't think was paved. And I can remember living on Warburton Avenue and looking out, and they paved it and put hay on top, you know. And for kids on a main thoroughfare, that was pretty exciting. The other thing, living in the city, we came up to Westchester, and in the city, on Thanksgiving is the day that you have the ragamuffin parade and everyone goes out and is dressed. And here in the suburbs, one didn't do that on Thanksgiving. You did on Halloween, which is completely new to us. And when you went to the ice cream store, in New York, if you wanted the sprinkles on your cone, you just asked for shots on the cone, and everybody knew what shots were. And you moved up to Hastings, and they would kind of look at you. You know, they call them sprinkles here. And so one had to learn to say, we want sprinkles on the cone. The other thing that devastated my mother is when we lived in the city just for the couple of years, she was an expert on subways. Went on every subway, got lost, came back, but she knew her subways. Loved the city itself. And she said to Daddy, well, where do I walk here? What do I see? Because there were not the stores and the shops. And but really the fatal blow was when she wanted to take us to the movies, and walked up to Dobbs Ferry, and they said, we don't open till 7 o'clock at night. Now, you know, in the city, by 10 o'clock they're open, 11 o'clock you're in business. Here, it was just unheard of. I mean, how, 7 o'clock at night the movies open. So it was, one had to get used to country living, so to speak. At that time, we went down to New York. My mother was familiar with New York. And we went to Klein's and Orbach shopping. And when we couldn't find what we wanted there, we took the subway up to Bloomingdale's on 59th Street. But I think I was a grown woman before I found out there was an upstairs to Bloomingdale's. The only thing I knew, there was a downstairs, which they had the basement level that was the subway level. And I guess that's the only thing I can say. It took my kids a long time to find out that there were big bars of soap. On trips, we always used to pick up the little ones from the motels. So their experience with large soap was the same as mine with, there was an upstairs to Bloomingdale's, you see.
Did your mom help in the barber shop?
No, not at all. My mother was as they say today, a homemaker. And she had a stronger hand than my father with raising it. They were good parents. My mother was a superb cook and a marvelous baker, as Hungarians are. And no, she didn't help. In later years, I don't know if she helped in the beauty shop, if she manicured, but no, she usually just stayed home. And because my dad was home and he was in the barber shop, we always had our main meal at noon. I know, which has no consequence, but I tell you it has. Most people ate their main meal at night because the father came home from work and the smell of chops and what have you would permeate the village, and you had your cold supper then. But my mother always made the main meal because Daddy was there and he came up, and there was enough time, and she could get it over with, and we came home from school, and as the kids today, for lunch period, we had an hour for lunch in this school from 12 to 1. Everyone went home. The kids that lived up on the water tower in Uniontown, the Sanitas and the Litwins, they went home every day. Where today the kids say, we gotta walk. Granted there were no perverts around at that time, but nevertheless the distance. But they made it in an hour, went back and forth, and we came home, and everybody made it in the hour to get back to school.
Did you work in the barber shop? Did you help out? Or?
No. When my sister and I were both taught to be hairdressers, and my mother and dad had friends in the business in the city who ran a beauty school. And I know by the time I was 16, I used to go down in summers, and so did my sister, and we knew our trade, and my father had taught us much, and but they were good years.
Who did the manicures in the barber shop?
I did. My sister was shyer than I was. I was always
So you
more.
did help in the barber shop?
Only in that respect, but I think Daddy may have had, now that I think about it, a chair which you sit up to have your shoes polished. That was the thing in the barber shop. Who did it, though? I can't remember. But I remember he had this very nice horse that he used to keep for the children, and they would come and have their hair cut on the horse. If they were going to cry, they'd cry anyhow. But it always was kind of nice to see the boys grow up. And one of Daddy's favorite stories was the little boy that came in, and when he said, which side do you part your hair on? And he thought for a moment, and he said, on the dining room side. And that the Stucklins, who still do work around, one of the Stucklin boys, oh, Mr. Boulanger, I love that teacher. She has such big muscles up here. And It was, you know, as I say, he watched many of these boys grow up, and it was nice. So anyhow, it was very, very nice.
When there was political turmoil, like during the McCarthy period during the 50s, imagine during the World War, when there was union problems, did people come in the barbershop and talk about those things?
I'm sure they did. At that time, the only recollection I have, when you say turmoil, McCarthy, communist, the only thing that stays in my mind at that time, what was this, the 50s? Before that, was it the 50s? McCarthy was after the war, was it not? I was very much wrapped up in myself at that time. Paul and I were married, I think it was after the war. The only recollection I have, and could never truly comprehend what it meant, was that Esther Decker, you're familiar with the Deckers, she wanted to run, I believe, if I recall correctly, for the president of the PTA. And there was a big brouhaha about that whole thing, that she was communist. And I believe she was defeated. She never did get the position. Not having children in school, and as I say, being wrapped up in my own, I don't believe I believe she never did become the president of the PTA because of what people thought, that she had communistic affiliations. And the Barnes, Bernard and Carolyn, they were kind of labeled too, because they were friends of the Deckers, as communists. I really didn't know what that meant. To me, communism, I didn't know what it meant in the sense of why would the Deckers or why would the Barneses be called communists. To me, communism meant, as one has the picture of Russia in its early days after the revolution, communism. Communism to me was, as the Frenchman said, and when he asked, what is communism? He said, if I put all my money in one pile, he said, will I get back as much as I put in? And they said, no, you may get back less. He says, then I don't want communism. Because everything was supposed to be equal and shared equal. As I see now in later years, what people say as communism, the Deckers and the Barneses are very democratic people. They accept you not for what you are, but who you are as a person. And I don't know if this is what was mistaken for communism. You know what I'm saying, Spike? You know that just because one likes a black person, then you're labeled nigger lover. I mean, it isn't right, any more than if you treat the gardener as you would treat the bank president. Is that the reason they were labeled? I don't know, as communists. Albert Decker suffered tremendous loss at that time. His career went right down the drain. And he was quite a prominent actor in Hollywood. And he was, I remember, in the Andersonville trial, he was on the Broadway stage with George C. Scott. And we went to see him. He was a marvelous, marvelous actor. But McCarthy, as the result of McCarthyism, his career went down the drain. And it never really did come back, and I think it was kind of defeated the man. Nicest story is that Albert Decker went into Paul's plumbing shop. I don't even know if I should say that, but yes. And he said, I need this and this and this done, because they bought the old Farragut house. And he said to Paul, and I have no money, and I can pay you when I have the money. Paul did the work, and I think sent one bill and never one after that. Esther came down, I don't know, maybe I don't know how many years later, and paid Paul the bill with interest. Paul returned the interest, and Esther insisted that he keep it. You know, what was fair was fair. He was a man of his word. Decker was too, and Paul could not help but admiring his straightforwardness, really, which is much better than saying, than stringing him along. Otherwise, it's an insult to Paul's intelligence. This way, he said, I need this, which is understandable. But the Deckers did stay on, and this has nothing to do with anything. But the Deckers had the 2 or 3 boys and the daughter, and the Barneses had their 3 sons and a daughter, and they would invite one another. This may be, you say turmoil. As I say, that is the only recollection that I have of McCarthyism, that it affected anyone locally.
But was it discussed in the barber shop?
Was it I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was. But it must have been. I have no knowledge of what the results, who felt, how, who felt. That I don't know.
Well, when you were manicuring in the barber shop, you don't have any...
Oh, no, because that was just, as I say, once in a great while. It was nothing steady. There were just a couple of men. So, as I say, it was nothing that was on any regular basis at all. Daddy, as I say, politically, they always spoke. Daddy had, the local mayors and the trustees or whatever. They always, they came in. The other place that they would congregate would be what is now the buffet. That was owned by Bolarowski. It had a great bar. And after village meetings or after they would go down there and have a few drinks, and I think their current affairs were discussed. The other place that they would go would be across the bridge, and Lucian. I don't know if you're familiar with the name. Across the bridge, there's this very nice, tall building. Let's see, who is in there now? And there was a very nice restaurant in there. And the meals were excellent, and the bar was good. And I think men would go there and, again, discuss current affairs and what have you. The village was very much divided at that time. It was a manor and it was a village. There was very little mixing of ideas or discussion. The village people were here, the hill people were there, and that was it.
Did they both come into the barber shop?
Daddy did not have much of the local people, the Russians, Polish, Hungarians, no. He did not. They went to barber shop across the bridge, and where was the other one? No, Daddy did not have that clientele. One reason is, at that time, and maybe it's still human nature, you never supported your own. He was of an ethnic background, right? In Hastings, as I say, there were as far as ethnic, you were either Irish or you were Polak. This is the way it was lumped. Hungarians, Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians resented terribly being labeled a Polak. But when, as I say, people don't know, that's the way it was labeled. Dobbs Ferry's ethnic minority was Italian. They would come and support Hastings, hairdressers and people, but not their own. It was quite interesting. It's a study in human nature, you know. In Hastings, we had problem. I can remember when Paul started business too. And as soon as you make a buck, then they feel that they're the ones, you know, that are responsible. Very, very peculiar. But again, when I say peculiar, there's nothing peculiar about it. It's human nature. And if one understands it, why, you accept it and take it for what it is. But I know you don't want that part of it. But as far as I say, the discussion, turmoil, politics, people, as I said to you once before, were too busy earning a living at that time, the ones in the village, to be too bothered with politics. They thought, this is not our field. Nobody listens to us. We can't get involved in this. As far as union in the shop, they were so glad to have a job and to work. And it was only after the war did they find out, that's this, after the war that they found out that we could demand rights. You know how, however the socioeconomical progression in other areas, the same thing happened here. There were only a couple of men in that, when I say that, across the bridge, this area there, that could verbalize enough and felt self-confident enough to be spokesperson for these people. See, this is one of the things that was, that they didn't progress as they did, because they were never comfortable in getting up and speaking in front of, let's say, if they were the manor people and the village people, they never felt comfortable enough to get up and speak. And it was only of late that one had, as Julius Chemka, for the mayor. This was never heard of before. It was only someone from up in the manor, you see, that was the mayor, or even one of the trustees. It's just that as I say, as the ethnic group here learned more, became more educated, and felt more comfortable and confident in themselves. Years ago, no one ever went up to school to complain about the teachers. If your child came home and said, "My teacher, whatever," then the first thing you said, "Well, what did you do?" And of course, one assumes that the teacher is right. No one ever complained. I've lost my thought, what I want to say. But as I say, and with the local group, you just accepted what it was and went through school, and the teachers were right. I don't ever remember anyone ever really up in arms until after the war, and when the union became stronger down here, that they had union meetings. And I remember Frankovich, he was the spokesperson. But as I say, Paul probably remembers more of this. As I say, I'm more for the humanities and not for, you know, the political side of...
Did your parents socialize with people on the hill as well as in the manor? Or?
We were very fortunate. We were never labeled as, we may have lived in the village. Daddy was the barber. But we were never categorized as such. So that Daddy had friends all over. And so, as I say, we never had any problem. I never had any problem in school. No, I never found that it affected me at all. But my father was, I say, a pretty wonderful man, and he always made me feel like I arrived. I don't know where, Spike, but I had arrived. No, we always had the confidence. And and it was just great. And
How did it come about that the Boulanger Plaza was named?
because Daddy had been acting mayor for quite a while, he was trustee for several years. And when I don't know if he was in office when he died. And so this is one of the things that John Philly, who was then mayor, I believe, I don't know if he was instrumental or who it was, but anyhow, they had named the plaza after Daddy.
When was he mayor?
Pardon?
When was he a trustee and mayor?
It has to be in the, let's see, Nancy was born in 50. I think the late 40s, early 50s, right there.
So he was a trustee first and then became mayor? Or?
Yeah, and because he was always very active politically. I remember he used to practice. He had to speak in front of the League of Women Voters, you know, and he wanted to have that right, you see. And but then again, you must remember at that time, I think we only had a one-party system. You've heard of that, where there was no competition really, but and it was a very, well, as all politics. There are many men today, I'm sure, whether it's any of the level of politics, who could do a better job, but it requires a certain type of person that are willing to put their foot into this ring, this political ring. And as Daddy used to tell me, honey, if you know you're going to be called a son of a bitch and you harden yourself, it isn't so bad. But one has to know what to expect. And sometimes he never even expected as bad as he had gotten, because I had seen him with tears in his eyes. Because as a parent, it's no different than politics. Many times you do the best you can, and for the people, and things are misconstrued, and you're called all kinds of names and what have you. And but it's rather a thankless job, I would say. Maybe today politicians are paid better, I don't know. But anyhow.
You said he was acting mayor? Was he elected or?
I don't know what, I know he was elected or whatever it was for trustee. I don't know who was ill or whatever happened, that he was acting mayor for a while and had assumed whatever role and responsibilities that whatever the mayor had.
Did he ever run for election or not?
I don't know, were trustees appointed? Yeah, and I can't remember, but he was a very persuasive speaker. Daddy had a lot of charisma. And if he ran for office, you better believe I think he could do it. And as I say, I don't remember the details of it. And as I say, quite a raconteur. My mother did not like the movies. Daddy would go, and he would come home, and then he would relate the movie to her, which she enjoyed thoroughly. And he was a great, as I say, storyteller. Wonderful, wonderful father. As I say, at 16, he took me down to Bulorowski's, bought me dinner, showed me how to behave, pulled out the chair, all the amenities, and taught me what to drink, how to drink, and one of the things he said, honey, you can't drink it all in one night. And I remember Paul being so very gracious, and we had Rambouille after, and Daddy is the one who taught me how to put on makeup, getting married. He's the one that spoke to me, and it's just a wonderful father. This is all that I can say.
You have one other sister?
Yes.
And any brothers? Or?
No. And so as I say, I've been, as I say, very blessed. Good father, good husband, and as I say, I'm great.
Is your sister still alive?
Yes, she lives next door, and our personalities entirely different. In spite of the fact you're raised by the same people, the same values, and but yes, she is there, and as I say, it works out very well.
And she's married now? What's
No, she is single, and she, as I say, lives next door. She kept a beauty shop many years. I stopped working when my children were born, and Paul always worked very long hours, and I just decided you cannot live in a world of people 2 feet high. And the thing is, I always took courses, and so I got a degree, and I knew that was not work that I wanted to do when it was time to go back to work. When I say time to go back to work, I stayed home, as I say, the 20 to 40 years, so to speak, and raised my children. And then to me, the 40 to 60 years was when you went back to work. And anyhow, and then I went back, as I say, as assistant to the housekeeper up in St. Chris, which was very nice. I did all the food ordering, the purchasing, the dietitian work, everything. It was very nice. But as I say, there has to be a growth. Otherwise, you just stay at a certain level. And when the women say today, they want to have it all, we just took it for granted that you raised your children and then went back. This was as a result of going to an alumni meeting of Vassar with a friend who lived down the street where we lived on Hoppy Avenue, and her name was Ruth Newman, and her father was the founder with Felix Adler of the ethical culture. And it took me a long time to why Ruth had such a placid nature and outlook. We'd drive along, she was the world's worst driver, and she'd make some mistake and so would go this way, and she'd always smile and say, thank you. I could never understand it. And she was just so delightful to her mother and her father. And it was as I found out about ethical culture and learned their philosophy and what have you, that accounted for much of Ruth's graciousness, good nature, however I can put it. But she was a graduate of Vassar and had 2 children. Her husband was a guidance teacher from Yonkers, and they moved to Hastings. And when Ruth's children became half-grown and Ruth wanted to do something, she found out she was not equipped to do anything at all. And Vassar almost prided themselves on the fact that we graduate girls and, you are not equipped to do anything. We went back. She invited me, and as a guest, we went back to a Vassar alumni meeting. At this meeting, it was discussed whether they should change the curriculum of Vassar, because our girls are complaining they're graduating and they're not prepared for the life that they are entering. They feel the education that they had is being wasted, child rearing and what have you, and they didn't know if they should add certain courses such as airline stewardess or home economics. And it was decided at that time that they would not change their curriculum. Vassar said, you have been taught to think, and you have been taught to research, and there isn't anything you can't do. You take a year's, for your master, and Ruth did that. And she went to Columbia and became, library science was her field, and she did become librarian. At that time, they said, you use your 20 to 40 years, your knowledge is never wasted in raising children, and use whatever abilities and whatever newfound knowledge you do have from the 40 to 60 years. That hit me right, and in those years it was applicable to the way life is, but it is no longer, today. And things have changed, but this is what I used as my guideline, and it worked out very well for me. But as I say, for young people, so as I say, this is one of the reasons I always went back to school and took classes all the time.
Now, where did you go to school?
Oh, I took several courses down at Columbia, because one of the women that were going down, I took English, a couple of things, with Truscott. He's the bridge expert on the Times, and they lived in Hastings, and we were quite friendly with his wife. And Alan, and what was her name? They had 3 children, and there was another woman in Hastings who was an avid bridge, not only player, but went around, and apparently she and Alan used to go to different competitions, and all of a sudden my friend found a little note as she's cleaning that Alan is leaving her and running off with his friend from there, and that was it. And they did divorce, but as I say, I went there, and then up at the community college, and so we, Lehman, I had one course, but anyhow, whatever came up, and at that time you could add up your things, and I'm sure I could have had with life experience, but as I say, but this worked out fine, and it.
Did you go to the Farragut School?
Yes, yeah. We started in the 3rd grade, and the lower school, and graduated from high school.
Do you have any recollections about going to school?
Going where?
For school, high school period?
Yes, very vivid, and all very positive. Things were very structured at that time. I can remember, yes, everything was fine, and everything went along in the progression that it should have. That you wore the saddle shoes and whatever, the band was still good. One still had to learn to march. One still had to have pressed clothes. There was a dress code, and there was a behavior code. There was not, this is one of the things, people did not interfere with school policy at that time. What was a carryover, as I told you, from years before, if the teacher scolded you, it was your problem, not the teacher's. And as I say, while I graduated, it was still the same. One had respect for the teachers. There was discipline. One did not smoke in school. One, as I say, there was a dress code, and it was very structured, and I feel the way it should be,
What did you do for social life?
Social life, one did not have the cars to run around in as one does today. There was not the youth center. The social life was very much like children's life. They did not need a social director. You made your own amusement. And as teenagers too, that's what we did. You band together with your friends. Occasionally someone had a car, but it was a time when one could not afford cars and going to bars. There was just not the money for it. And you bided your time until you became an adult to indulge in adult activities. Not only sex, but drinking or whatever the case may be. This is something that one earned the right to do. How else can I tell you? You know, you got the hots for someone, but you sat on your hands because one did not become sexually promiscuous or active. There was always the bad girl in town, you know. But as a whole, one did not. And as I say, a big deal was to go to Yonkers on Saturdays. That was quite a busy, busy place, you know. And there were the 3, 5, and 10s in the stores. And that was a big weekly activity to go to Yonkers on Saturday. White Plains, well, that was far away, and one did not get, and that was very high class, White Plains. I mean, whoever went to Altman's, or, I mean, this was big money. And at that time, if one went to White Plains, a woman in shorts, you were given a ticket by the policeman. We were very fortunate. We had a summer place, Daddy, up near Mayapack. And we had that from 39 till 53 or 50. And we looked forward to summers and kids that were there, you know. But what Hastings had was, and rather unique at that time, was a girls' fife, drum, and bugle corps. Now that I think about it. And it was quite large. I bet you there were 50, and it was divided up, and we were taught to play the bugle, the fife, or the drum, whatever one chose. And we used to, I think it went on 3 or 4 years that I remember. And these are years, I guess, from 14 to 17. We went to different towns. You know, we were hired to play in their orchestra, band, parades, as they are now. That was a thing that we did. Never too active in church. Catholic church was boring, and as I say, I used to hang out with a Lutheran group because they sang in church, and I loved those songs. And the pastor was very, very nice. You know, he wasn't one step above God or below. So as I say, I hung with the Lutheran group, and as I recall, it was very nice. I changed, converted to a Lutheran, and when I did, Paul said to me, "Why did you do that?" And I said, "Because you're Lutheran." And he said, "I'm not Lutheran, I'm Episcopalian." But again, when he was in the city, he always spoke about Pastor so-and-so in the Lutheran church, and his experience was the same as mine. He hung out with a Lutheran group. So therefore, I just assumed that he was Lutheran. But nevertheless, my mother, who was not really religious, but felt she should be crushed, you see, when I converted. And because the sense of drama, you see, you have to. And my father explained to her, "Mother, there's only one God, and it really doesn't make any difference where they worship, you know." And even with Nancy today, with Martin, to me, I feel there is one God, and otherwise, Howard Johnson would not have 38 flavors. Because if you don't eat vanilla, Spike, let's try strawberry. If you don't like that, try chocolate. If you don't like any of those, we have 35 other flavors. And I feel God and the religion is the same way. It's basically ice cream, and however one chooses to worship. And I only take the good from any religion. The hell and the brimstone I leave behind. I only take the good. So as I say, I am very happy in my very simple way. But no, there wasn't too much. You hung around. There was a 9 o'clock whistle that blew. Anaconda blew a 9 o'clock whistle every night. And that was be home by the 9 o'clock whistle. So you came home. There was an 8 o'clock whistle in the morning, and you knew you had to be up by that time to get to school on time. Anaconda was very busy, and our little town here, everything was around the Anaconda. The local restaurants, it was great. Men used to come up from the office. The shop workers, they had their lunch. They never came up, but the shop and office, rather the office people, always came up to the village, and the restaurants, the local beaneries would do a very active business, and there's been quite a change since they went out of business. And the other night, lying in bed, I hear the train. One always heard trains backing up, hitching up, and it was such a part of our life. And as people will say to us now, don't you mind the trains? When one lives in Hastings all their lives, you always hear trains, because there was the Putnam Division that ran by the Parkway, and that was really a commuter line and very busy, and so was this. So you're always aware of trains, and it's not something that one thinks about. It's just, part of living in Hastings. But I've always enjoyed small towns. My sister and my mother, they're city people, and they like but I like to know everybody's business, and I don't care if everybody knows mine. And but as I say, I have always enjoyed living in a small town in Hastings.
What's your sister's name?
Irene. It's interesting now to have my daughter live in town and have her children go to the school, and when neighbors will say, oh, that's your mother, or the children have a nana, because, being such a transit society and one doesn't stay in the same neighborhood, they think we're very lucky, which I think we are too, But as we have changed, everything has changed, I'm sorry I can't help you any more than I can, but as I say...
Was there a movie house in Hastings?
Yes, quite interesting. There's a movie house that was built where on Warburton Avenue, across the street from the liquor store, that building was the movie house, and it's been reconstructed now, modified into a little shopping area there.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the movie house, built, I believe, the 27, 26, and the Morgan boys, I don't know, these are actors, Ralph Morgan and Frank Morgan. Frank Morgan, the best way to identify him and to relate to him, he was the wizard in The Wizard of Oz, the Judy Garland and all, and he was the wizard, and that was Frank Morgan. His brother Ralph was a much quieter man, and he was a fine actor too. They lived in Hastings. Whiteside, who lived on the end of Riverview Place, apparently he was an actor. Billy Burke. All these people, I think, were instrumental in having this movie house erected in Hastings. And I can remember the first sound movies that were here, and it was Al Jolson. Movies, when you said socially, what did you do? At that time, the time I was growing up, most people went to the movies twice a week. Sunday nights, I don't know, it seemed to me on Sunday nights one always went to the movies. And then you went in the middle of the week when the program changed. Bingo was played, dishes were given out. It was a Depression era. And yes, movies played a big part in the Hastings life. The other movie was The Embassy in Dobbs Ferry. For some reason, if we didn't like the movie here or saw the movie, your mother gave you money and you went up to the Embassy in Dobbs Ferry. She always gave you enough for car fare, but candy was much more important. So we used to spend the money on candy, and you walked up to Dobbs Ferry. You went through the village and were taunted. Hastings-on-Hudson, Hastings, and you knew you were going to get that, but you thought, well, it's much flatter walking here than going at the split, then you'd have to go over the hill, you know. So you went through the village and were taunted, and they knew that you were from Hastings. And but you went to the embassy, and you had your candy, and you saw the movie there, and then you very bravely walked home. You walked down the village, that was fine, that was lit, and then all of a sudden you would get to where the Cabrini home is now, and my dear, you would get scared out of your wits, because there were only the lamplights that were very tall and the bulbs were this big, and they were, it seemed to me, a mile apart. One did not have the apartment houses as we have now. These were all estates, and it was dark, and so you ran like the devil in between each light, so that you would run from here to there, and then you got there safely until you got to Hastings. And this was the other activity that one had. The other Sunday activity besides going to the ball game was walking the Dobbs Ferry Road. Everyone in their Sunday finery used to walk the Dobbs Ferry Road. And there was nothing much else to do. You went to the movies at night, or if there wasn't a game on Sunday afternoon, you walked up to Dobbs Ferry, turned around, and you came back. They were very simple pleasures, as they were in all, I'm sure, American towns, you know. And that was it. One had Sunday shoes and one had school shoes. And we're not above having holes in our shoes. And when my daughter went to college, for a long time she didn't show me a pair of shoes, and finally she showed them to me. And she said, "Honest, Mommy, I did not break them." And I said, "What do you mean, honey?" She said, "Look, there was a hole in her shoe." She did not know that you could wear holes in your shoes. This happened to be a favorite pair of shoes that she had. And I can remember we used to put newspaper in the shoes, because you got shoes at Christmas time and Easter time, and this is how you kind of carried yourself over until you got the shoes. In school, I can remember, I don't mean to digress, but apropos to walking to school with a newspaper on the bottom, when the cafeteria was open, which was wonderful in school. They had excellent food, cooks, what have you. In the time before that, as I said, everyone came home for lunch. And the only time you stayed for lunch in school when there was usually a hurricane in September, and the weather was inclement, and the teacher would say, "I think you had better." And the village kids always had either bologna sandwiches, some meat sandwiches, and the manor kids had peanut butter. Well, Spike, we traded sandwiches like crazy because my mother, and as I say, other ethnic people, you didn't have peanut butter. It took the roof of your mouth at that time. It was not homogenized. And the only time you had peanut butter was at birthday parties, and they would smear it on crackers. But we used to swap because they would love to have the bologna sandwiches that we had, or spice ham, whatever it was, and we loved the peanut butter because we never got it at home. But one only brought lunch to school, and that was a big occasion, as if the weather was going to be really inclement, you know, and you couldn't get home. The other time we brought lunch is when they had the bus and we went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art from school, or the Museum of Natural History. And at that time they were building the West Side Drive. And so we would go down and, you know, as I say, have our lunch or what have you. Someone asked the other day about traveling or what have you. In high school, the big thing was every high school class went to Washington, D.C. And it was, I don't know, you went on the train and you stayed in the hotel, and all this was big experience because at that time one didn't travel to any degree. Mainly, I think it's the funds. One did not have the funds. And so this was a big thing. The graduating class, the high school class, always went to Washington. And there's always pictures being taken, you know. And I think you learn, I don't know if you learned, if you did smoke or you did drink or whatever, you know, but nothing really too exciting by today's standards, you know.
Were there tag sales? Did people have tag sales?
No, people did not have tag sales. At that time, you have to remember, they didn't have a welfare system, but what they did have is the people, were they on welfare or they did not have, they used to send government surplus to the municipal building. And it was bags of flour, dried milk, things of that nature. And I always remember there were only about 3 or 4 families, I think, that went down, and they all had little carts that they pulled, and they piled the stuff on there. I won't even mention the name because today stigmas, you know, they still stay with you. I remember the girl who had the baby out of wedlock. Do you know this is 40 years? That's the first thing. So as I say, one forgets but one remembers, and I would never say anything that would stigmatize anyone. But they went down to the municipal building, and I can remember the mother and the kids, and they pushed up the flour and what have you. At that time, the local butcher shops, there was one on Spring Street where the jeweler is on the corner now, and the next little store, that was the butcher shop owned by the man who owns that building. There were butcher shops on Washington Avenue and a couple across the bridge, and they all had these purple indelible pencils. And the book. Did they have them in your day? And then you came and you bought your meat, and then the butcher with the purple would write in the numbers. We never had one. And I used to think the greatest thing would be if we had a book and the butcher would mark our stuff in. My mother always gave us money to buy whatever we needed. You go get 10 cents worth of spiced ham or liverwurst or bologna. That was enough for sandwiches for 4 people. When we felt flush, you got 15 cents worth of boiled ham. But that's what they did. When you said, was there any, what did you ask me, any tag sale? People are very proud. As it is, when I worked up at St. Chris, we used to get government supplies, government surplus foods. That Spike was superb. Top quality, the butter, the cheese. During Carter's administration, a lot of peanuts. Really, they were wonderful, and peanut butter. The black kids would never never eat it. And they would rather that you had Skippy peanut butter in the jar, because you see, or they would never wear secondhand clothes. Any more than when my daughter worked up there, and the women used to say to me, the black women, the kid, said, Miss Freitag, how come you let your daughter do that? You know, deliver the food or what have you. Because she knew who she was, and she could wear secondhand clothes, and she could eat government surplus, because she knew who she was. With the kids up at St. Chris, they didn't know. And to them, anything that was secondhand or not new was charity, and they have their pride, and you have to recognize this and respect them for that. People here were the same way. So the thing is, you didn't show that you didn't have the money by having a tag sale or by anything that would denote that you could not afford things. There was a pride, and you just didn't do that. There wasn't anything of this type. Nothing at all. Sundays were Sundays, observed as such. Everything was very structured, and within the law. Kids were still respectful of parents, and there was always the few rebels. But you kind of looked at them and, gee, I'm never going to be like that. So as I say, I don't know, to some, I really don't know what it means, but it was, what it means, I think, is we had guidelines. You knew where you were and what you could, what if you overstep something that you would be punished. And I think today, maybe this is one of the problems. There are no guidelines, and one does not take punitive action truly for things that are done.
Were there a large number of bars in Houston?
Large number of what?
Of bars?
Bars. Large number of bars. Yes, because in that time, let's see, Prohibition, what was it, 32? I don't know when Prohibition. Before that, of course, there were no bars. And and then as I said to you, then there was always a little home booze all on Washington Avenue. The man who had the dry goods store, you went in the back and you got your palinki there. Women made it, and there were certain houses you went to, and they could always, you know, give you the shot, and they made their little money. One also made their own, if you were smart like my father and mother. We lived on 78th Street, and I never related the story until, I don't think it was more than 5 years ago that I ever had it come out of my mouth. My father making bathtub gin on 78th Street, and the stove went on fire. And my mother and father swearing me to secrecy. And I tell you, it was not until a couple of years ago that I ever say anything. But everybody made bathroom gin, and I knew how to color it. You know, you caramelize the sugar, and Scotch was a little darker, or whatever, however it is, the rye. And we still have the measurer that you measured the proof. Have you ever seen one of those? The proof? Tall glass, which I use to hold a single rose now. And I also have the glass that comes down, and on the bottom, is it mercury balls? And you stick it into the liquor that you pour into this long, and then you dip this other glass thing in, and wherever it bobs like a scale, you know, wherever, that's the proof of the liquor, and that's how you determine it. So anyhow, after Prohibition, then I guess the bars opened up, and yeah, I would say there were quite a few in Hastings. Yes, but across the bridge, ethnic people are harder drinkers, I guess, you know. And as we said, it was always the beer and the shot. That was it. And then the Farragut Inn, that was run by the Kaufman boys. And they bootlegged whiskey at that time. And all underneath Spike, I don't know, there's caverns or whatever, but there were barrels, you know. And, but the Kaufman boys, there were two brothers, and they have their homes on Olinda Avenue now. And Bill, one of their Kaufman brothers' son, was in my class, and he is our accountant today. Billy Kaufman was always the smart kid. You know, as you went to school, there was one that was the devil and the other one that was the smart. Billy was always a smart kid. He was the president of the class all the time with rosy cheeks. And as I say, he is the accountant today, and still, I don't think he's gained a pound. He lost his hair, but he still looks the same. But the Kaufman brothers, that was a high-class bar, restaurant bar. The others, I would say there were quite a few bars in Hastings, right?
Were you allowed to go into those, or were they never restricted?
I don't know. In that time, women did not go into bars. And as I told you once, the only thing I know is I could go in, and if I wanted money, I'd tap dance, because one of the local, Sweeney, he drank pretty heavily, and when he was sober enough, he would teach tap dancing. And so I had learned the buck and wing and whatever from him. And if you ever wanted money, you just go to one of the local saloons and you dance. And they used to give me money, and I could buy candy. And as I say, we would do that. And I don't remember what effect it had on my father or mother or whatever, but as I say, cars. Did I ever tell you about the taxi companies we had in Hastings? It was a great commuting village, Hastings was. And we had a taxi company, two taxi companies. And you could always tell when the trains came, and all the taxis would come down and they would wait at the station. And in the wintertime, when the snow was heavy, people would ski down from the hill, and the railroad station all had the skis all lined up, and no one touched them, no one stole them, and they would, I don't know how they got back, if they schlooshed back, what do I know, or if they took a taxi back, but they would ski down when the snow was right. But the two taxi companies, one was the Brennans, and the other one was owned by Jack Kane and Happy Holleran. They eventually became the school bus drivers, Jack and Happy, and everybody knew Jack and Happy, and they knew the kids, and they drove the bus, and Happy drove it until he got too old, and Jack contracted measles or chickenpox from one of the kids, and he met his demise by that. But that was very nice too, when the taxi companies used to go up and down, and there was the certain riders, and one could always tell a Chevy from a Ford, from a Buick, from the women that came down to pick up their husbands, and at that time one could identify all the cars. Not today that everything looks like a Mercedes or whatever, you know, and who can tell what. And they used to change, and these people that had cars, most every other year, I think, would they turn in their cars. But these women drove cars, and they called other people dear. And I thought that was so wonderful. Well, dear, how are you, you know? And my mother never said that. And I thought, isn't that great when they said, well, dear, how are you? I remember Daddy having to tell me, because I didn't know what the Encyclopedia Britannica was. And the kids would, Encyclopedia Britannica, And I remember going home and asking my father, what is this Encyclopedia Britannica? Parents of the ethnic group could not help their children with homework. And I often wonder how we ever got by, as I can see Nancy having to help her children, and I'm sure you with your son. I don't know if teachers are not as dedicated or thorough as they were at that time, but do you find that your son, his penmanship, or the way he holds his pencil, is it the way you do? Or we were always taught penmanship, and one had to do this and one had to do that, and if you didn't hold the pencil this way, today they all look like they're maimed or crippled or something. I find Nancy and Bonnie, I think, are almost the last of the ones that are writing all right. And because I noticed the young nurse, I took one of the kids down to Nancy's, and they all write in this manner. My sister was just down in Columbia last week. The anesthetist, he had this same thing. So as I say, I don't know, but we managed to grow up and know where the Nile River is and the continents. Maybe it was not the most exciting. A lot of it was by rote, and things were disciplined. But I don't know. I rather think it was better because I don't think kids really know what's good for them. Otherwise, a very fine actress would not have a director. They have to know how to channel their talents and
But did the bars then serve a similar function as the barber shop? As a gathering place? Or?
I don't know. I guess so. Never having frequented them, I think there were different types. The hard drinkers and the ones that got drunk and went every day. That's one thing. I think gathering places in barbershops were not as frequent in my father's era as they were in Mr. Stroman's, because people did become busier. When I say Mr. Stroman, that was early 1900s. Daddy was later. When you say gathering, they really didn't gather. The men that went in, I know to Daddy's barbershop, whoever happened to be there, there was a good exchange of conversation. I don't think one hung around or one had time to play the chess or one, no, I don't think it was a place to congregate at that time. It was a place that they happened to meet. Again, I think times changed at that time. As far as bar rooms, I really don't know. I think it depended, upon the type that it was, a bar room.
Were there particular restaurants or coffee shops that people opened?
No. When I say no, the one that had always been here, do you know where Panvel Jewelry is now with that nice little garden? That was a restaurant that was owned by Mr. Frisbee. When we first came to Hastings, that was there, and Mr. Frisbee ran the restaurant. He lived in the house in the back. And you went to Frisbee's, and they always had the blue plate special and excellent pie. I can't remember if there were other restaurants at that time. The diner was on the right-hand side, but that came, well, I guess that must have come in the 30s. And, but at that time, as I say, people did not the average person did not eat out. It was not the money, and they just was not the thing to do. If people ate out, there was some place over on Bronx River Park where they went. I can't remember the name. Just a couple of places around that people went for dinner. But it was the exception rather than the rule, and there were no fast foods. If you wanted soft ice cream, custard, one didn't have a Carvel. The big treat was to go over to White Plains. White Plains, just as you come out of Hartsdale up Dobbs Ferry Road, there was the Carvel stand there, and one drove over there. That was the first pizza pie place over there in White Plains. There was nothing of that type in
Was
Hastings.
there a hotel in Hastings?
Where the Farragut is now. They had rooms upstairs.
In the Hastings?
The Hastings house, that was, what did I say before?
Farragut.
Yeah, Farragut Inn, and then they changed it. I believe they had rooms there. Turn of the century, 18-something, there was a hotel down on the river, owned by Beavers. I think we have a couple of bottles from there on the bar. And they had a hotel there. Beavers Hotel, and then he became Judge Beavers. And he was your typical wonderful small-town judge of white hair and nice little paunch, and he walked down every day from in back of the Presbyterian or whatever Episcopal church. Judge Beavers lived there, and very stately he walked down every day to the municipal building, and it was Judge Beavers. And I don't know if it was he that ran the hotel or whether it was relations, I don't know. And but there was a hotel there. And but I never remember it. When we came to Hastings, it was all Anaconda. And the south end was the Zinsser Dye Company. And they made dyes, and I think the Germans used to come up, I tell you, in submarines and get the dye here during World War I and go back. Colonel Zinsser, that was all his estate, right opposite where we are. And Colonel Zinsser drove his big car, and his daughter married who was the ambassador to England, and that was our claim to fame. And Colonel Zinsser went down every day in his big car, his string tie, and toward the later years, he didn't know which end was up, but he went down every day, and everyone humored him. But, no, there were no restaurants. Before we came to Hastings, and the trolley car used to come from Yonkers, up Warburton Avenue, go around Main Street, and up the hill, up Farragut, and then back to Yonkers again. The people at that time, up in the country, they had what they called a Punky Barry. Has anyone ever told you about Punky Barry? Punky Barry was a gathering place for Judge Beavers and of his contemporaries. And they had a clubhouse, and that was, I think, where the Uniontown baseball field is now. And up there was Punky Barry, and went up there with the trolley car. And they used to have their knockdown, drag down beer parties and what have you at Punky Barry.
Now, what was Punky Barry?
Punky Barry was the name of the club, and that's all I ever remember about it.
Was it a
before.
real club? I mean, was it a house or something?
It was a house, and they could gather in there, and I don't know who belonged, but anyone of that generation, it was Old Punky Barry. The on Farragut Avenue, as one leaves, four corners here and goes up, you pass the school, and to the left, area there, all the houses. Where this island is, here's Farragut, and Mount Hope goes here, and here's Farragut, and there's this little island, and all those row of houses, and that was called Germantown. Fred Schmidt lives there, who was the postman, because we only had a couple of postmen, and he made rounds twice a day. Not like these people now that throw the magazines away and what have you. Chris Schmidt, it was a 10 o'clock delivery and a 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock delivery. And he made the rounds all the time and delivered the mail. And he is the one person that lived up in Germantown, and I guess one of his mother or aunts or something is still alive. But that was known as Germantown. And Uniontown was, as I say, where the trolley car went up to Punky Barry. Longview was the wonderful hotel that was up on top where Andrus is now. And people used to sleigh ride. And they would start up at Andrus and come all the way down the hill, down on Broadway, down on Main Street, and all the way down without being killed, and that was quite a feat. I don't really remember any of that. Only stories that I heard from people, as I say, that lived in the house where we lived. And the library, I remember when the library was in the Hook and Ladder on Main Street, and that's where our library was. And after the municipal building was built, then the library was transferred to the municipal building. And Miss Stetson, white-haired, very dedicated lady, she was a librarian for many years. And homework was done up there. And everybody respected the quietness that was demanded of the library. And then it was the Hook and Ladder right that was there. There were chicken markets in Hastings. Across the street from the Hook and Ladder. And there were about 3 or 4 houses opposite what the Lutheran church and the Polish church is now. They were called the Dorland houses. They were the Dorland sisters that lived and built this house next to the Farragut house. And apparently they had money, and I don't know, they built these little cottages opposite the Lutheran church and the Polish church. There was a stream, very active stream that ran by there, and it came through the Christie estate, where the A&P is now. It was all rolling green hill. And up on top of the hill where the apartment is now, the Christie family lived. You still see the Christie groceries. This was their home, the Christie home. And they had their water. One could see there the stream ran through, and then the stream ran down. And the stream ran past these little houses, and it did come down Spring Street. And that's the reason Spring Street is called Spring Street, because there was a spring, and underneath it's all tunneled. Paul could tell you about that the water goes down. But that's why it's called Spring Street. In one of these little cottages lived an Italian family, and they had chickens in the back. And it seemed you either went to Yonkers for the chickens, or you went to these people in Hastings. And he was always very dapper with his hat on the side. And they would, whatever chicken you wanted, they would take it and they would cut the throat, slit the throat and clean it for you. And that's where one went for chickens. And it was, then otherwise you went to Yonkers. And on Riverdale Avenue, there were 2 or 3 places that sold fresh chicken. Paul and I swear, courted in the chicken market on Saturday night. I don't know why. Every Saturday it seemed to me, my mother said, go to Yonkers and get a chicken. Maybe she thought we'd stay out of trouble or something. But anyhow, we went to Spitalnik, and you selected your chicken, and you always felt the breastbone, and if it wiggled back and forth, that meant that it was tender. And they would butcher it. And again, we accepted that was our way of life. One saw how the chicken was bled, and sometimes she dropped the chicken and the chicken would run around without the head. Therefore, we have the expression, a chicken without a head. I relate this to you because from then we knew where we got the chicken, the meat, the stuffed chicken we had on Sunday. Nancy had a friend. My daughter had a friend. And for what reason Paul had a holiday off, because he always worked, and we thought we would give the kids a break and take them to the chicken market. Well, we took them to the chicken market, and fascinated, horrified, I should say, they watched the chicken that we selected, how it met its end. The chicken market owner's wife was always there. And she always had a big sweater on and an apron in front of her. And she's the one who dipped the chicken by the feet into the hot water, tied it around with a string, and took the feathers off. The change that came about from the time Paul courted and I courted and until we took our children down was that the owner's wife no longer had to feather or defeather the chicken, but they had a big rubber cylinder with holes in it, and she just took the chicken by the feet and put it on there, and as the cylinder went with the little holes, it defrocked the chicken. All the feathers came out. Well, our friend Jeannie only ate 3 things: steak, chopped meat, and chicken. She was one of a very picky eater. When we came back from the chicken market, and I don't know, a week or so later, we got a little note from her mother saying, "Dear Anna and Paul, I just want to thank you. Jeannie now only eats 2 things, chicken and steak." And I mean steak and chopped meat. Being of German extraction, and we eat ethnic food, we went down to New York, and anyhow we had bought very fine chopped meat for tartare steak tartare, which has to be fatless and nice and red and all. And we put the egg in the middle, the chop, and Jeannie happened to be over that day. My children are used to that, good rye bread and the steak tartare, and you put it on, and we kept saying, "Oh, Jeannie, this is so good, you'll have to try it." Jeannie took a little tiny bit, and I can always remember she sat in that chair in our other house up on Hopkins Avenue and pondered on this piece. Finally, after quite some time, she threw it in her mouth, let out a scream, and said, "Nancy, I've just eaten live cow." Okay, so Jeannie survived that, but again, we got another note from her mother. "Dear Anna and Paul, thank you very much for exposing Jeannie. She now only eats steak." This is the God's honest truth, Spike. But it was so funny, and she was not really angry, but it was just very funny. So as I say, I'm not quite sure what Jeannie eats today, if she has ever gotten back to chopped meat and chicken and what have you. But at least we knew where the chicken came from. I know when my daughter was student teaching, she had to get milk or cream and make butter for the kids because, you know, you just thought it came in a package. You didn't trace it all back that it really came from the cow and what have you. And, and as I say, we only had Jell-O in December. We never had Jell-O in July. I think that's what makes, I think my generation, one accepts things a little easier, or one doesn't need maybe instant gratification. I don't know, because we knew that you could only have Jell-O December and January. That was the only time it was cold enough for it to really gel, before we had refrigerators.
How'd you get to the chicken place? Did you walk or take a trolley?
No, one always took a trolley. You could get by this time, when we came to Hastings, they terminated the trolley car at the Yonkers City line. So one had a bus service that ran from the city line to the drugstore on the corner of the bridge, back and forth. We also used to have village characters, which we don't seem to have now. And we used to have one that was called Annie Kutzap. And Annie Kutzap was the homeliest person you ever saw, with her teeth missing in the front, and unfortunately not too well put together, and straight hair that came this way, and a bobby pin that went there. And she hung around the bus drivers all the time, and she just thought their main goal in life was to have Annie Kutzap one day, you know. And, well, anyhow, Annie always hung around the bus drivers, and they always humored her. But to save the money, you usually walked to the city line. And one walked to the city line, and then you got the number 1 trolley, and that took you into Getty Square. You could pay 10 cents and go on the train, but that was 10 cents. This way you could do it for a nickel, you see. But most of the time, we walked to the city line. I can't remember if we did with Paul. I guess when you're keeping company, you walk, right? So we must have walked down. I don't know if we had a car at that time. I don't know. Maybe my father had a car. Maybe we drove. I don't know. But if one went to Yonkers, you usually walked to the city line, and then you took the trolley. And then when you came back, there were always a few people in the village that had a car. And they would never know you when you were standing there waiting. They would pick up whoever they came to pick up. And it was at that time I vowed that when I was grown up and when I had a car, I would give anyone that I knew a ride. Because we also used to go to New York on the number 1 trolley, and then you transferred at McLean Avenue in Yonkers and took the number 4, and that took you to the Woodlawn Station. And that was the East Side subway that we used to take down. Number 1 would take you to Van Cortlandt, and that was the West Side, but we would go the East Side. And when we would come home, and there would be sometime there would be Hastings people, and they met whoever it was at the Woodlawn Station, and they didn't give us a ride. And to me, I thought that was terrible. We had to wait, I don't know, for the trolley car, I guess, whatever it was. But again, this is a study in human nature. And there are people to this day will do that and will not do that, you know. But, and Yonkers was very, very interesting with their stores and with their ice cream stores, the chocolate shops. Just lovely. It was such a pleasure, you know, to go. This was big time to go to Yonkers. And there are many people, you know. In fact, I had a neighbor on Hoppy Avenue, and he was in his 40s, and he had never been to New York. And there were a lot of people that were that way, that just never did go into New York. And we had always gone in. Paul was born and raised in New York. My mother, as I say, was the subway maven, believe me. And as I say, my sister and I always went down alone, and when I cheated in beauty school, I used to ride the subway, so we always felt comfortable. But there were many people in Hastings who had never been to New York, and were very sheltered in a way. It was quite interesting.
Were there houses of ill repute in Hastings?
It's funny you should ask. I don't know. The only thing I know is what is the Beau Rivage that was formerly called a Dixie Inn. I think that was a house of ill repute upstairs, because Paul would never ever take me there. And when the kids were growing up too, I don't know, we always kind of went by this way. And it was a long time, I think, before I found out what the reason was. And I think they had, I don't think Paul frequented them, but men usually know about these things. As far as locally, as the expression goes, there were always the girls and always the women who would give it away, right? So I don't know what the going rate was, or I don't know how it worked at all, but there was always the loose women. As there was always, I'm sure where you grew up too, there was always, as I had made reference earlier to the bad girls. You know, there was never the other side of the tracks here, but you always kind of knew, you know, that they did. And at that time, you did not. And but other than that, I really don't know. I don't know. I think it's a case of you went maybe to Yonkers. I don't know. I always remember there was a German family that bought the Farragut Inn, which is now the Hastings House, and they really made it go. Because for a long time after the Kaufman boys, and I tell you the era of the, it just didn't make it. And this German family came with two girls, and the food was good, and Inga and I don't know what else, the other one, and I did the youngest one's hair, and very good customers, good tippers. And I had been married at that time, and as I say, Paul and I were married 10 years before we had children. Not by necessity, but by choice. Therefore, I would usually get, and what do you do, not do, okay. But I remember one of the daughters of the Farragut Inn came in, and apparently she must have had some extracurricular activity besides waiting on the table, and she was pregnant, and she wanted to know what I did, and I said, well, whatever the case was, she came in the next time and bought something for me to insert in her. And I thought, this draws the line. You know, I will shampoo your hair and I will do your hair and hair, but that's where it ends. I'm not inserting anything. If you knew enough how to get that way, then you know that you don't put this thing in your ear. So, but it's funny when you ask that question, this is what I remember her coming in, and I thought, I'm not going to do it, you know. But as I say, and we have always been very legitimate. We had, as I say, used a diaphragm, and as someone will say, you mean back then? As I say, but as I say, I don't know what her problem was, but she never asked me to help her out again. But she did continue with her hair, and I guess she resolved her own problem in her way. Then we had another local doctor who was excellent, excellent doctor. And in fact, when I was pregnant with Nancy, and Mrs. Freitag, why didn't you come earlier? And I said, well, whatever I had said. And he said, you know, because I can detect at a very early age, early stage. And the reason we found out he can is because he was running an abortion thing down in the Bronx. And one of the local women, and she's still around, claims that one of the policemen had impregnated her and that this doctor had aborted. And she squealed on the whole thing. As a result, he lost his license and did move to California. He lived right on the corner of Farragut and Olinda. But as I say, we had our little Peyton Place kind of thing, you know. But nothing really terribly earth-shattering or exciting. But other than that, I'm sure we, and as I say, we change here the same as every other town has. With people.
Hair?
Pardon?
What did you do people's hair?
My father had the barber shop, and my sister and I had the beauty shop on the other side, and that was on Spring Street. And because Daddy would come and help us, you know, when we were busy, because he was a good hairdresser, and he taught. We lived in the city at that time, and he went to beauty school then, and my mother had long hair, and she dozed off one night, and he cut it. Yes, exactly. And my mother was never very handy with hair, but it worked out wonderfully well for my father, who was learning to marcel, which means nothing to you. Marcelling is done with a hot iron that you heat on gas, and that opens up, and you learn how to do the waves, and that's what you do. And he would marcel my mother's hair every Sunday. We got money, and we had to go to the movies. And you went to the movies, and my God, we'd come back 3 hours later, my mother'd still be there, my father'd still be curling. He taught my sister and I, and you have to learn how to roll. And we got very adept at rolling this marcel iron, and could marcel quite well, and then it went out of style, which was terribly dirty pool, because we were all prepared for this, you know. And as I say, they didn't marcel any longer. But anyhow, the barber shop was on Spring Street, and it was called the Municipal Barber Shop. And as I say, it was on both sides, and we got busy. Daddy could help us, and it worked out very well.
Now, who came in there?
Into the beauty shop?
Real people, or?
No, we had a very diversified group. You have your regulars into the beauty shop, right? And women only had permanents at that time every 6 months, so your very busy season was before Christmas, before Easter. They had local dances on Saturday night, so you were always busy getting hair done. There's certain women that always had their appointments. But they were local people, and we had quite a few Italian people from Dobbs Ferry that came, because one of the good hairdressers was Italian, and she worked for the other beauty shop in Hastings, and they would not go there. They would not support Jean.
Why is that?
I told you, I don't know, it's human nature. Any more than Hungarians or whatever would not come to us. They're going to make you rich.
Now, did people play games there also, like they did at your father's barber shop?
Oh no, this was strictly beauty shop, you know. And people came for their appointments, and you did them, and they left, and this was it. No congregation, nothing at all.
And how long did you live there?
Well, it must have been good 10. Gee, I started when I graduated from school, but I was all finished then. I was licensed 17 to 27, and I had my children I was 28. I guess 12, 15 years, I guess I worked there, you know.
And then when you had the kids, you stopped?
I stopped, right.
Where did you meet Paul?
Paul, I met him at my aunt's house in New York, and I was 16 and Paul was 17 and shy as could be. Paul blonde hair, nice rosy cheeks, and the first time my father saw him, because he was very friendly with my cousin. And Daddy thought if he had had a son, he would have liked to have a son like that. When Paul asked me to, and then my cousin's parents had a farm in Connecticut, and they used to bring eggs every week. And Paul drove up with my cousins, delivering the eggs. And when he asked me out, Daddy said to me, "You'd be very nice with that boy, because he would be a nice boy for you." And I was going with someone else at the time, and I was never a very rebellious daughter, and I thought I may as well learn to love this man because I'm going to marry him. And as I say, it's 48 years, and so my father was right. Because when Paul asked for my hand, which I thought was very nice, and Daddy always said, "Anna, you'll never, be for the want with this man," and which is true. Excuse me. Oh,
So how soon after you met Paul did he ask you to get married?
Couldn't have been very long. No, I don't even think it was it a year? Maybe a year. I was out of school, and Paul was working. And then Paul moved up. I know Paul moved up here, and he started to work for a local plumber here. And then it was, I guess, shortly after that, because the only thing that Daddy said that he will have to earn $40 a week, because that's what would support a wife and a child, but we're not going to have any children yet. He said, "Honey, a woman never knows." And he was so wise, But those were the restrictions. Paul left his job in New York, which he loved and they loved him, because Paul is a very hard worker and a very dedicated, but he moved up here I guess my father said it was time for Paul, for the growth, for the movement. And Paul was very shy at that time. And I guess like many young people, you need someone to help you to move. And as I say, Daddy was very persuasive and had a lot of common sense. And yes, so I guess it was at that time.
When did you move to Hastings?
We did 19...
I know, but was it after Paul had moved here? Or?
No, we came in 1929. I was 8 years old.
Oh, so he met you here?
And
then?
I met him in the city at my aunt's house. And he was a city person. He was born and bred in the city.
I see, but you were living in Hastings at the time
Yes.
that you met him in New York City.
Yes, and then, as I say, he always came up here with my cousins, because my cousins, he was very friendly. He knew my family better than I did, as I say, with my cousins and with my aunts, because that's who we were. And the cousins that I refer to were young men, and they would just come up here, and they enjoyed the ride coming up to Hastings, and on hot nights they would all go swimming in the river. And this was in the country.
Did you swim? You used the river for swimming as well? Or?
We used to go down and swim in the river, and your mother didn't drive. There was no place really to go to swim. And so if it was hot, you went down the river. And you just took your towel, everybody went down. And if you got impetigo, if you got ringworm, which most everybody did from the river, then you just went to the local druggist, to Joe Aljo, and what was it, 15 cents or whatever, rub this on, and it'll go away. And that's because I don't know if everyone had a local druggist. They did everything but deliver babies in the back room. And, but no, we went down to the river. It was always uncomfortable, but, and not much, you know, the trains would go by, and the rocks you had to sit on, and the bottom is very sandy. It's like the Sound. The Sound is that way if you go off Rye Beach or any of them, or even Westport. It's soft. It's not very pleasant, but it's wet. And if you got hot enough and desperate enough, you swam in the river. The river rats always used to swim off the old Buccaneer. The boat was there then, and they always used to dive off there, you know, but we were never that brave. We came, sat on the rocks, and spread your towel out, and that's where we went swimming. And but as I say with Paul, then I don't know. We were married before the war, and then after the war broke out, he had to go into the Anaconda at that time, but he was deferred a couple of times, so because of his work, and I think we were married a year and a half when Paul left, and then I think he was gone for 2.5, and then when he came back, my father urged him to go into business. When I say urged him, sure, he rented the store and everything. Daddy always had great company, and in Paul, and been very fortunate. It's worked out very well. I always feel it sounds very Pollyanna-ish and very corny, and I don't mean to say it, but like the luckiest person in the world. And as I say, I always feel I am. You know, as I say, the world in general, God has been good, and it's been. My father was great because he let you be your own woman, and Paul is the same way. He always let you be your own woman, and it's a wonderful thing. This is what I have.
Anna Freitag's house.
I need to ask you about when you first lived in Hastings, if you could describe your home and what kind of things you had in it, and then you said that you had moved to an apartment.
We moved from New York City to Hastings in 1929, and we lived in a 4-room apartment above the drugstore, 542 Warburton Avenue. I believe Peter, it was 542 Warburton Avenue, above what is now it's formerly Jacobson's drugstore. There's a drugstore there now. And there, I believe it was a 4 or 5 room apartment. It had bathroom. There wasn't any central heating. If I'm not mistaken, there still isn't any central heating. And main source of heat was the coal stove in the kitchen, as I recall. That was a 4-family house with a store underneath. The rear of the store, what is now Boulanger's parking lot, was a huge backyard with a private house in it. And there, Mrs. Pocharski and her family lived. And Mrs. Pocharski's husband had a butcher shop where the drugstore is now. And Mrs. Pocharski had 3 children, Frank, Walter, and Helen. Mrs. Pocharski was the mistress of the manor. she was the one in that time, in that era, because when you were a foreign extraction, you usually did not speak English too well, but she was one of these very aggressive women, and her children, and they had money. I think she made it in real estate, plus the fact she was quite an SOB. No heart at all. She owned these apartments on Main Street where Manzy's is now. She owned all those, plus the building where we live, plus this big house. Her son Frank, and they were all geared to musical instruments, and at that time, one didn't have the money to give the children music lessons. But Mrs. Pacharski's, Frank had violin lessons, and Walter had piano lessons, and Helen, who's the Shirley Temple of the family, lovely platinum blonde hair, she took dancing lessons. Frank, to this day, is a music teacher, owns music, sells musical instruments in New Jersey. Very nice wife. She was from Hastings. Walter married very well, and he married a woman from Guatemala, one of those Central American countries whose family owned a banana plantation. And unfortunately, he met his demise. I think his head was cut off with a banana knife or what have you. Instead of nationalizing, when the time came you had to know when to give it back to the natives. They didn't, and apparently they did him in. But anyhow, Mrs. Pacharski lived there in this very private house, and she was Mrs. Pacharski. And we lived, as I say, in this four-family house, and it was at that time, and it overlooked Warburton Avenue. And it was wonderful because they paved Warburton Avenue at the time that we were there. And it was, if not a mud road, but I can't remember, it wasn't very substantial, whatever it is. And they put old Hastings pavement block down and then straw over it, and it was wonderful. Because just imagine when you take the main thoroughfare and you cover it with straw and your kids can play on it. That was wonderful. Across the street was the A&P, and very nice. Had butchers in it. You went in, and it had, and it was a huge A&P, and it had all the groceries and vegetables, and the young men worked there, and you went in, and you read your order off, and they got everything. This was before supermarkets.
Where was the A&P located?
Right across the street from the drugstore, what is now the drugstore on the
On Warburton.
on Warburton, on the on the east side of the street, right? There's one here, but this one was formerly Jacobson's. I don't know. Do you remember Jacob?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. It was across the street from there.
So where
Then,
the laundry was? The
yeah,
laundromat is?
yeah. There was a great. It encompassed 2 or 3 stores, and they broke those up. A little further up, a little further south, about 2 or 3 stores down, was another market, and that was James Butler. And James Butler, the estate that is where, not Ciba-Geigy, what is the other one? When one goes down the hill after Elmsford, and you can cut across on 100, the big company that is there, they just moved. They moved quite recently. Anyhow, that was the Jimmy Butler estate, and he had his racetracks up there. It was beautiful, all these big, huge trees that are still there. If you go on Sawmill River Parkway and pass the restaurant that's there now, there's whatever the white one is, and you go up the hill, and then you go down the hill, and then you can take 100, that will take you right across this estate. And that was the James Butler estate. And James Butler was a chain, again, of grocery stores, and we had one in Hastings. Then we also had a Gristides brothers. And the Gristidi estate, as you know, was up in back of the A&P, where the, what is the name of that apartment house that's on, in back of the A&P? The Terraces. That was owned by the Gristidi family. And they had their old homestead there. And the trolleys were taken out before then, so we had to take the bus on the bridge down to the city line, and then from there you went to Yonkers to do big shopping, so to speak.
Did you have a garden when you were first?
No, we never had a garden. No, we didn't. People who lived, I can always remember down around Railroad Avenue, Ridge Street, they used to go up to the Zinsser area, what is there now on Edgar's Lane. They always went there and grew. We never had a garden.
And then you moved to Hopkey?
Oh, that was many, many years after. In 1929, as I say, we lived on Warburton Avenue. My mother was, and I was 9 at that time, 8 or 9, went into the 3rd grade. And my father had the barber shop on the corner of Spring Street and Dock Street. Wonderful. And my mother never liked Hastings. She's a city girl. And so we moved back to New York for just 1 year. And that was in 1932, and that was really the depths of the Depression. And whatever business Daddy had bought there, and he commuted from Hastings. It just didn't make it, and we had to move back to Hastings. And then we moved, which was a great apartment, on top of what is now Tony's, the restaurant right on the bridge. Marvelous apartment. And old Mr. Ansel owned the building, and he had the bar room and a German deli downstairs. That was the most magnificent smelling deli you have ever smelled. He made clam chowder there on Fridays, and this was really a old-time German deli. And then we stayed there for a couple of years, and then, as I say, we moved down to Spring Street. We had a big apartment there above the barber shop, and I think I was there until we married. These would be married, 58 or 48, 49 years, so it's a long time already. But we moved up to Hopkey Avenue in 1953. 1953, 54. Right. And that bordered the old Burke estate. And Mr. Grant lived across the street in the big old stone house that was Mr. Hopkey's house. Hopkey Avenue leading in from Olinda, that was Mr. Hopkey's driveway, and you went into the stone house. Mr. Hopkey owned the sugar factory in Hastings, staunch Lutheran, and when one was a guest of Mr. Hopkey, you were there over the weekend, we all went to church. We all went to the Lutheran church. And that was all the Hopkey property there. And I know when we lived on Hopkey Avenue, parcels that we had to buy, there was a descendants of Mr. Hopkey, and it was terribly difficult to clear that property. And finally, it was like something for something, like $100 in a barrel or wheelbarrow full of rocks. Something quite, maybe not bizarre, but a little unusual. Finally, the property was cleared, and but they're all large estates here that were, as I say, broken up.
And when did you know Mr. Hopkey?
No, Mr. Hopkey had died long before, and the house was almost in ruins. And Don Grant, who was a middle-aged I guess he and his wife must have been dancers in the theater, and he bought the house for $3,500 and then started a children's camp. And in the summer, he had the children come there and what have you. And the Deans own it now. Joel Dean he only died a few years ago, and he was an economist, one of the leading economists, very eccentric. But they had 38 degrees between he and his wife. When they moved to Hastings, they moved there about the 50s, 55, 56, 57, and they came with their 4 children. And it was Joel, Gretchen, Jurian, and Jillian. And Mrs. Dean, extremely intelligent woman, but unfortunately she was an alcoholic the years that she was there. And when she saw me washing windows, she came over and she said she doesn't do anything quite as mundane as that. Whatever she does for posterity, such as refinishing the woodwork. And they had just gotten a concert grand piano, and she said, my dear, she said, we need that, as some people need a 3rd bathroom. So they had 2 baby grands, but they needed a concert grand. And I always admired her because she said when Joel and I were married, she said we decided they weren't going to have children. And then she said we made a very keen observation. She said those that had them enjoyed having them. And so really at the risk of life, and she had 4 children, and there were 2 boys and 2 girls. They had their own string quartet, and those kids practiced every day. Money was no object. They had accounts in all the stores. When I say all the stores, hardware stores and the stationery stores, anything that would enhance their education or whatever they were interested in, other than nonsense, they could go. And she screened the children very carefully whom they played with, because she didn't want them. They were very definitely academic, oriented. And Mr. Dean was on the board of Oberlin College and also on Ford, owned a big avocado farm in California. And just before he died, he was given another degree, and the whole family went over to Sweden or Denmark or wherever to get it. But a very brilliant man, very brilliant, eccentric but brilliant.
What was it like going to school in Hastings?
Going to school in Hastings was a delight. It was an absolute delight. There was a direction, and the classes were only separated to the point of, let's see now, 3, if there were 2 classes and one was just, I don't even know if it was a little faster than the other, but they were divided up. And you were in with a group of children that were socially different and economically and as far as intelligence. You were in with kids that were smarter than you are. You were in with kids who were just ordinary, and you were in with kids who were slow. And this taught you tolerance for the ones who were slower, gave you a little confidence that you weren't that bad, and because the ones that were smarter, that made you work a little harder to keep up with them. The only special class that they had was for the children that were a little really backwards, and we used to have quite a few of them in Hastings, and they were really much slower. and that was the special class. And Helen Goodwin always had that class. And there was about 15 kids in it, you know. But going to school was great because the teachers were there year after year. They were all dedicated teachers. You knew who you were going to get or didn't want to get next year. There was a fairness about grading and discipline. I don't know, I always found, because I went to school in the city for a couple of years and hated it. The city schools are so cold and whatever. And when I came to Hastings, it was just wonderful. And it was a joy.
What kind of courses did you take?
In high school, I took, at that time, I took a business course in high school. We were not college-oriented, education-oriented. Christian people were not. If you came of that, if your father before you and your mother before you went to college, you went to college. But if they didn't, and Jewish people are much more education-oriented because it's always, the whole background, everything. In the city, there were the city colleges, and all the kids were pushed to go to city colleges. And here in Hastings, unless you could really afford to send your child to college, one didn't take a college entrance program. It was either a business or it was industrial, which many of the young men took, you know. But high school was very nice.
Did they have foreign language?
Yes. Yeah, and one had to have a foreign language to get into college. Yes, they had the foreign language. And that went on the wayside, I guess, when my children started school. But because I graduated from Hastings in 1939, and at that time the requirement was one had to have foreign language.
Which ones did they offer?
Latin and French, not Spanish, but Latin and French.
And what other kinds of courses were there? Were there any other special courses that were offered?
There was not tremendous amount of enrichment. Is that what you're referring to? No. There were not very many, enrichment courses. But what they did teach, if it was the math and the English and it was done in depth. This is the difference. We had art, and always a very good music program, always a very good art program. But the gymnastics were average, nothing outstanding, but they were here. But the music program was always good, the art program, good. Other than that, and they had chemistry. Mrs. Owens taught the chemistry. But one studied more in depth of whatever subject they did offer. And there were no two ways about it. You were expected to pull your load. And if you didn't, you weren't passed. It was as simple as that. At that time, one didn't get passed on to, let's keep it moving, If you didn't make the grade, well, then you flunked out and you had to do it over again.
And you said that you took business courses?
Business courses, they had typing and shorthand and bookkeeping, and that's what I remember was the business course.
And what was the other alternative that most kids took that didn't go to college?
Industrial. But that was the boys. They had a good shop program, and that was the industrial program. They had a lovely, lovely setup for home economics, which I think all the girls took because one just took home economics. And I almost think it was compulsory. Teach you how to make eggs a la goldenrod, how to make a bed, and they had a nice setup of an apartment, and they had kitchens, about 10 or 12 kitchens. so that a class could come in and 2 or 3 to each set up. They taught you to sew. They had sewing machines. I always felt one could come out of school, and if it was business, you could enter right into any office because you were skilled enough at typing and in shorthand. Perhaps it needed more intensive work, but you could very easily go out and get a job just with the skills that you did have.
Was there a lot of recreational sports offered with the school?
No, because one didn't need, see the difference in that era and now, it was a much safer era, number one. Children could do things on their own, go up to the Uniontown Field and Reynolds Field and play ball or go ice skating without the fear of either other kids jumping them or someone raping them. The other thing is your parents were too busy. Either your parents had to work, well, when I say work, just staying home and washing clothes and drying them and ironing, and I don't know what the ladies on the hill, whatever they did, that one didn't need, as children today almost need a social director, as for organized play, or I'll call up John so he can come over and play with you. We had none of that. There was no understanding of that. You went out in the street, and where are you going? Out. What are you going to do? I don't know. Depends on who you're going to meet. And so whatever you did, and you made up your games. You played Ring-a-Levio, or you hung around, or as I say, you went down the river, you swam. To go someplace to swim, this was a big deal, Either your father was working, who drove the car. Very few women drove cars at that time. Recreation, no. There was no youth center. Children seemed to, should I say, be disciplined? All right, there was more of a fear of policemen of authority figure. And if the teacher told you whatever, or the policeman, there was no such answer as, you just did what they told you because they were the authority figure. And boy, if you didn't, you would really be in trouble. But today, apparently, there's not strong enough punitive action taken, so, the attitude is, well, what the heck, we may as well do that, no one's going to do anything about it anyhow. No, there were no recreation groups at all. It was cold and you had ice skates, and lucky enough to have a pair, you went ice skating. If you had roller skates, you had brothers or sisters, you usually shared them and fought like hell, you see, because who was going to use them never occurred to you all day, but the minute you did, then your brother or sister wanted to use them, Balls, you played a lot of ball. The same thing as the kids in Europe, a lot of soccer, because there's nothing else available, right? And here, we played baseball or whatever the case may be. Girls sewed, they knit. No, there were no recreation groups that I can recall at all.
Did the community celebrate holidays together? I mean, they have parades, Memorial Day parade and that now, but was there, on the 4th of July, did the community go out and celebrate as a community?
Not to my knowledge. This was never a type of village or Hastings. I think it's more communal now, and we'll celebrate together than it did at that time. There were more separate entities at that time. As I said to you, the Lithuanian club and the Russian club and the Hungarian club. The other people, you see, the Americans or what, they may have celebrated. Now, where there's more of a communal feeling, and I think there always was up in Dobbs Ferry, till this day they seem to join forces and do things. Hastings, I never had that feeling.
Did you ever belong to one of the clubs?
My dad was with the Hungarian club. I had, Daddy was active in the Hungarian club. He was a great musician, and but in all these type of clubs, or in any club, whether it's the Hungarian or whether it's the Irish, there are all these factions. It's always a few that keep it together, whether it's an ethnic club or whether it's the Republicans or whether it's the Ladies Guild. There's always a few that is active, and the nucleus, and they keep it moving. And then we have the other ones on the outside saying, gee, they run everything, but they won't do a damn thing to help it, you know. So it's typical. But people in that era kind of hung together because this was their common bond, their nationality and the language, and that's what they felt most comfortable with, speaking their own.
Did they ever intermingle?
No, I wouldn't say. Not too often. It wasn't polarized, you know, as much of it is today, you know, which I think it is rather than drawing together. They seem to be pulling. No, you understood that this was your group and that was the other. No, there was no, no, not mingling. One of the things, you couldn't communicate. I mean, if you spoke Italian, the other one spoke Russian, there was not too much mingling. Because you just couldn't communicate. So everyone just kind of stayed in their little own group.
Was Hungarian spoken in your home, or?
We spoke Hungarian all the time because my mother was pure Hungarian. She spoke no other language. Where my father spoke German fluently and Serbian and Italian, and Hungarian was his secondary. You know, really, he didn't speak it too well, but because he was married to my mother, we spoke. That's what we spoke at home. As a result, we just spoke fluently. And when I went to Europe with my father the first time, and when I was 4, when I came back, my mother and sister didn't go because my sister contracted diphtheria. But when I came back, I couldn't speak, or I would not speak English. My mother had to teach me all over again. But no, Daddy was bilingual, and but we just, as I say, spoke Hungarian at home. And my mother was an excellent cook, and we still follow that route, you see. I still cook, and have her board to make noodles and what have you. And anyhow, it's nice. And my children are also, they cook too, with the enthusiasm, I should say, that I do, you know. So the flavors are there, and I guess will be kept up.
Do any of them speak Hungarian?
No, that's very unfortunate. Unless, what happens, and I know what happens, if we both spoke the same language, then we would be fine. But Paul, he did always speak German fluently, and he understands whatever. And my mother, we had the opportunity, but you know what it is, these children are so wonderful, you just don't want to miss a thing. And we just felt we were going to miss something, you know, and so unfortunately they don't. You know, children